Great. The chat is continue to buzz with the relationship between nursing and clinical engineering. And next, we would like to go ahead and introduce Ronda Bradley, a registered respiratory therapist and master level education in her background. Ronda and myself have been collaborating on the Healthcare Technology Foundation on several projects relating to education, about ventilation, about alarm management, and I'm looking forward to hear her presentation about the collaboration between respiratory therapists and clinical engineers. Ronda?
Thank you, Dr. David. This is a great opportunity, and I am proud to be invited to speak with such a prestigious group. And so I appreciate this opportunity. And in talking with you about the collaboration between respiratory therapy and clinical engineering, I had to smile as Dr. Khalil was talking about clinical engineering being in the basement, and how we've had the opportunity to move out of the basement. Next to clinical engineering in the basement has always been respiratory therapy. So I'm going to talk with you a little bit about some of that experience that I've had in sort of growing up with clinical engineering. So just to give a little background on respiratory therapy, because I know we have such a great international audience here today. And not everyone practices respiratory therapy in their own home countries, the same as we do in the United States. So in the United States, respiratory therapy is a minimum of a 2-year program with an associate's degree in science in respiratory therapy. We also offer bachelor's and master's programs as well. There are 2 national board exams that one must pass. The entry level is CRT, or Certified Respiratory Therapist, and the advanced practice is the Registry in Respiratory Therapy. We have 448 respiratory therapy programs in the United States and Puerto Rico, which are overseen by a national board in the United States for credentialing. There are approximately 155,000 respiratory therapists in the United States. So in these days of COVID, everyone can imagine why we are scrambling to need more respiratory therapists. The technology, as you know, doesn't fix itself, doesn't maintain itself, and at the patient bedside, doesn't manage itself. Next slide. So on the international front, Canada has programs that are very similar to the United States. In fact, I know many respiratory therapists who practice in both countries. China, Italy has a master's in respiratory therapy, the United Arab Emirates, Singapore, Taiwan. There's such a big growth in the Middle East and Asian countries. And then also in the South American countries, it's growing. Respiratory therapy programs are growing. Colombia and Venezuela are 2 that I'm very familiar with, as I have friends who now practice in the United States who first started their respiratory therapy careers in their home countries of Colombia and Venezuela. Next slide. So my personal history in collaboration with clinical engineering doesn't start in the 60s or in the 70s and 80s, but I will say that in the 70s and 80s, there was a lot of collaboration between clinical engineering and respiratory therapy in sort of developing devices right inside the healthcare facility. There weren't a lot of technologies that were specifically designed for certain populations. Myself, for example, started my career in working in neonatal and pediatric healthcare. And so this was a new and upcoming area. And so we would constantly and commonly partner with the clinical engineering department to sort of adapt adult devices to work for our pediatric patients. As more regulations started coming through in the United States, and there were less and less off-label uses or non-FDA approved uses, that collaboration with respiratory therapy and clinical engineering did not go away, but shifted more to electronic medical or electronic healthcare records and looking at connectivity of devices. Next slide. So as you're going to be seeing here are several different mechanical ventilators popping up. And this is just a small sampling of the different devices that we use. Through COVID, the federal government in the United States has commissioned the purchase of up to 14 different brands of ventilators. This has created a big challenge for us in respiratory therapy and absolutely requires the collaboration with clinical engineering. And that is specifically for the mapping of the information from the mechanical ventilator to the health record. Each one of these ventilators that you see on this screen and many others have labeled their different modes and breath types in different manners. So for example, one ventilator might call it PRVC, one might call it autoflow, one might call it volume targeted ventilation, one might call it VC+. Every single device out there made by a different manufacturer might label it in a different way. And as we try to take that information from the mechanical ventilator and move it to the electronic health record, it is essential that clinical engineering and respiratory therapy work collaboratively together to make sure that data is mapped correctly to go into the health record. Next slide. So I'm going to try to quickly touch on 3 different areas of clinical area that respiratory therapy is currently working and where we can partner with clinical engineering. First, in acute care, I've already mentioned the electronic health record, but it also goes to other areas as well, especially in purchasing new equipment. And I think this was mentioned by one of my colleagues earlier, looking at not just maintaining the current equipment, but clinical engineering should be brought in early on when a decision is being made about purchasing a new device. That device communication is important. We also need to look at routine maintenance of the devices. Can it be done in-house? Can our own clinical engineers be trained to maintain that equipment? And looking at that as a cost of ownership that will be sometimes shared between clinical engineering and respiratory therapy, or sometimes will be on the burden of respiratory therapy. But without including the clinical engineering, we might not have a clear picture of what the true cost of ownership will be. And then looking at maintaining equipment. I can tell you many times in my experience in acute care where we needed to bring in clinical engineering locally from our own facility into a conversation with the engineers at a medical device company. So it was so important to have those 2 engineers talking together in their own engineering language and the respiratory therapist there to mitigate any questions that might come up specifically towards the interface with patients. Next slide. A second area that I've been had the opportunity to work is in subacute, or what we call in the United States, LTACs, or long-term acute care facilities. In these facilities, mobility is absolutely essential in improving outcomes. So even patients on ventilators becoming more mobile. And in my experience with this, I helped to open a hospital in St. Louis in 2005, where this became our focus and center point. We wanted to find a way to marry the ventilator, a heating system, oxygen, suction, monitoring, all with a mobile power supply so that we could get patients up and move them around. Next slide. This facility is called Rankin Jordan Pediatric Bridge Hospital, and it is a facility that, again, transitions patients, particularly babies, pediatric patients, from the acute care facility to the home setting, and they've trademarked the name Beyond the Bedside. And on the far left of your screen, you see where the clinical engineering department helped us to make a mobile trolley, if you will, with all of the things that this little baby needed. And for his mom there, his mother, to give him a little stroll out into a garden, to go out to playgrounds, and even at very young ages, getting into a normal life routine and environment, and the play as the work of children can really improve their outcomes. In the center picture, you see myself holding one of my favorite little fellows that we really worked closely with to get him up and mobile so that he could be participating in play and be a baby. And on the far right of the screen, you see a mother pushing her baby in a stroller with a new device that's on the market that actually puts all of these different technologies into one box. Next slide. And that brings me to the last area I want to talk about, which is to look at the R&D partnership with medical device manufacturers with both clinical engineering and respiratory therapy. I have been blessed to spend 7 of my almost 30 years in the field of respiratory therapy, working for medical device companies, helping to develop new products. And in those jobs, 7 years, I spent 2 in the United States and 5 in Israel, working directly reporting to clinical engineering. And it was a great experience and learning to figure out how we could make the most efficacious clinical devices to answer clinical problems, to make those devices durable, to work in the environments in which they were going to need to be used, and to also decrease the cost of ownership of those devices. And if I have time, I'm going to quickly give you a story about an example of this. In working with a device company in Israel, we were trying to overcome a challenge of there being too much humidity or water vapor in a line. And so we used the product Nafion to help wick humidity away from that system. But as we started introducing into other countries outside of the United States, we found that we maybe had not solved the problem. And it took together with myself and engineering to have a discussion about why it wasn't working as well in Germany as it was in the United States. And so if you think a little bit, if you're familiar with Nafion and how it works, it requires a gradient between the humidity inside the tube and the humidity outside the tube. And it worked well in the United States because in the United States, in most of our healthcare facilities, we have a very controlled heat and humidification or HVAC system. But when I found the challenges in Germany, even not going to Germany, my colleagues there were saying, oh, but our windows are open. So in Germany, we found that they had opened the windows even on a day when it was raining. And so their gradient wasn't there. So we found that we needed to find a different solution for some markets that didn't have closed HVAC systems, but used fresh gas flow in their facilities. And again, the COVID reference is perfect reference. We've had to find different ways to manage gas flow in our facilities in the United States than we might be in other countries. Next slide. So I just have so many wonderful examples in my, like I said, almost 30 years of working as a respiratory therapist, that if it had not been for the partnership with clinical engineering, we would not have been able to see the positive patient outcomes that we did. And we know that there's much more work to do to get those partnerships stronger and to be working more closely. You see my email address on this slide. You're absolutely welcome to use that email address if you have questions that we can't answer in the chat after this. Thank you so much for this opportunity.